member because it's working.
I think that's a frivolous motion. The member will resume his seat. I call Kiritapu Allan.
Madam Speaker, Madam, I perhaps will seek to bring a little more decorum to the House as we go into the final stages of this particular reading, Madam. Madam, it's a great honour to rise to my feet to speak on this particular matter. Post-maiden speech, these will be the first remarks I am honoured to make in this House. And having some reflecting as I scribbled a few notes, you think back to why you come to an odd place like this, to stay up till 10 o'clock at night, debating the nuances of these various matters. And reflecting on the Rates Rebate Retirement Village Residents Amendment Bill, it really, I guess, it strikes at the heart of why most of us come to this House. Because we're trying to make right the wrongs that have or do exist by anomalies in our law for the little guys, for those that are most vulnerable within our communities, and for bringing this bill into this House. To the Honourable Ruth Dyson, I want to commend you for your work and note that this is exactly the type of bill that many of us came here. These are the types of laws that many of us came to this House to make. So thank you for your hard work. And it's on that note too, I think probably many of us, particularly those first-timers that come into this House, we come into this House after 9 years of absolute frustration with the conduct by the opposite side of the House that looks at things like this. And you see, it's a simple bill, as been said throughout this House. It's a simple bill that has a measurable impact for many, many people. And those people that this bill has a measurable impact upon are those that are some of our most vulnerable within our communities. The measure of any society, they say, is in the way that we treat our most vulnerable. And when we think of them, it's usually our children and our elderly. Now, the reality is you look, I'm very proud to stand amongst a government that where our Prime Minister is the Minister for children. Thank you, for children and poverty measures. But I'm also very proud to stand in a government that has been bastions are standing for those most vulnerable at both ends of the spectrum. And I want to acknowledge too, because he's in front of me, the Right Honourable Winston Peters for his constant work at the coalface and advocating for our senior citizens. Yeah, right. And Madam Speaker, now, when many of us have just come off the back of a hard yards campaign out in our various regions. Now, I want to acknowledge the Speaker and Tolly, who's not in the House right now, but the member for the East Coast. Now, I come from the mighty... Oh, sorry, not in the chair, but certainly will be in the House, no doubt.
Order. I must remind the member not to refer to members who aren't present.
My apologies, Madam Speaker, but I want to make a reference to the Member of Parliament for the East Coast, because I'm a very proud resident living in the East Coast, and all throughout our region, Madam Chair, one of the striking aspects that struck me consistently throughout our region was the amount of our elderly that came to me with stories of extreme poverty. The amount of elderly and those that advocated on their behalf that would bring the most egregious stories about, the amount of our elderly that are too ashamed to tell their stories of how they actually don't have a roof over their head, or how they're living in crowded accommodation, or how they can't afford to go into retirement villages sometimes. But it's bills like this, simple solutions that have immeasurable impacts for so many of our citizens. And I guess I'll turn to the nuances of that bill now. Now, when Big Norm, as he's been referred to previously. But when Norman Kirk introduced our primary legislation, which was the rates rebate back in the 1970s, and I must admit there were some cackles from across the other side of the House, or perhaps it was this side, that some of us that sit in this chamber now aren't old enough, weren't around at the introduction of the original Act. I'm one of those members. You're offended. The good sir over there, Mr. Jamie Lees Ross, was offended. I wasn't offended, but it made me reflect. Look, at the time when this bill was introduced, it was introduced to give reprieve to those most vulnerable within our communities, to give them a little bit of, to ease the pockets just a little bit, and provide some kind of rebate by way of rates to some of those members in our community that simply didn't have enough cash in their back pocket at the time. Now, that was 40 odd years ago, over 40, well, it's 45 odd years ago. Well, at that time, it hadn't yet been envisaged that retirement villages would become popular residential environments, but we know now that it's a growing area where many of our elderly live. And in fact, I think that over 50% of our residents now that are living in retirement villages are superannuants, so not necessarily of major means. But this bill, a very simple bill, a very effective bill, enables so many of our elderly to have a little bit more cash in their back pocket. Now, I want to acknowledge that there's been widespread support from those that are at the coalface who work within this environment. In particular, I want to acknowledge John Collins and the Retirement Villages Association. I also want to acknowledge Rob Wilson, Dick Williams, John Moore, who are the office holders of the Retirement Village Residents Association of New Zealand, who have all swung in behind to see sensible, practical, common sense legislation like this legislation pass through this House. Sir, when I was going through the submissions that had been made, one of the first that I stumbled across was from one of our constituents from the East Coast, Fred Woyson, who is a resident at Carter Retirement Village in Te Puke. Now, that took me back to my childhood, you see, because my mum, working class woman, she was a cook and a cleaner at the Te Puke Retirement Village for many, many years. I spent many, many years growing up, really, in those retirement villages and seeing the daily life that many of our elderly and superannuants at that time were living. It can be a measurably tough life if people aren't of sufficient means. I remember spending many Christmases while my mother cooked in those retirement villages for the residents, and noted, that for some people there wasn't necessarily a lot of joy come around each Christmas, and I remember that every single year, because if you hadn't been fortunate enough to be able to set aside savings for your retirement years, another year over, another year, not too much in your back pocket, Madam. So I reflected on that, and I felt compelled to make comment that over the course of the campaign too, those memories flooded home of sitting amongst those retirement villages through my childhood. And when I went up to, for example, Kiritapu Retirement Village in Gisborne or Dunblane Retirement Village in Gisborne, the common request from many of the constituents living within those environments is, look, we just don't have enough to get by. Look, the superannuation amount in our back pocket is just not enough to get by. People spoke directly to this bill, that it might just enable them to have a slightly better life, Madam Chair, and for that, and for what we hope and what we know will bring just many more benefits for our constituents, particularly in the East Coast, which I'm very proud to be from, for those 15,000 people that are superannuants that are living in the East Coast, but many more throughout the country, where they will have a couple more dollars in their back pocket. Immeasurably proud. Madam Chair, almost there, no. Madam Chair, it's an absolute honour to speak in favour of this bill. I just want to note that where there is what we found for 9 years over the opposite side of this House was that there were all these issues that we could see them bubbling to the floor at every single stage, whether they were with our children, whether they were with our elderly. But there was this complete opposition to actually cut through and act for those that were most vulnerable within our communities. And Madam Chair, it is with absolute pride that I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote is called for. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.